Hello everyone, thank you for joining me again and welcome to any new viewers. This is To The Point English with Ben. I'm Ben, and in this video you're going to learn how to use the comma in English writing. Okay, so grab a pen and paper because you're going to want to take notes in this video. I'm going to go relatively quickly through the different ways, but this is a video so you can pause it, rewind it and watch it again if you need to. But let's go straight on to the first way to use commas in English writing. So we need to use commas in non-defining relative clauses. Now don't worry too much about the terminology, that's not so important. The examples should make it clear how and where and why we use commas. So it's with relative clauses with non-essential information and with these words, who, which, whose and whom. So here we have two examples. The film, which is set in the 1980s, is based on a true story. So here we have a non-defining relative clause, which is set in the 1980s. That's non-defining. It's non-essential information. It's extra information. And the other example there is the main character, who is played by Brad Pitt, is a flawed hero. So here the non-essential information is who is played by Brad Pitt. So how do you know if it's a non-defining relative clause? You can simply check that if you remove that clause, that information, does the sentence still make sense? So in this case, the film is based on a true story. That's a perfectly good, complete sentence. And the main character is a flawed hero. So it's when you're adding non-essential information, this extra information, that you need to put a comma before and after the clause. Okay, I hope that's clear. Let's move on to the second way to use a comma in English writing. Independent clauses. So this is to separate independent clauses in compound sentences. Again, don't worry about the terminology, it's not that important. The examples will make it very clear, I think. And we use these with coordinating conjunctions. So these are words like and, but, or, so, for, yet, and nor. So if you look at these two examples, she studied hard for the exam, she never felt ready to take it. Stephen was always late for work, his boss fired him. So here there are no commas, as you can see. You just have, in each example, two sentences. But if you want to link those two sentences, you're going to need to use one of those coordinating conjunctions and a comma. So it's that simple. She studied hard for the exam, but she never felt ready to take it. So this is why we call them independent clauses, because they are sentences on their own, or they could be sentences on their own, but in one sentence they become independent clauses. So that's very important. That's one of the most common uses of the comma. And it's very simple, really. Just when you can think that there are two sentences and you're linking them with one of those conjunctions, use a comma before the conjunction. Okay, let's move on to the third way of using the comma, which is also very common. And it's one of the most common mistakes that I notice my students make with commas in their writings. And it's introductory word or phrase. So you have to use a comma after an introductory word or phrase. So looking at these examples, taking all this into consideration, I believe the most appropriate course of action is to, etc. However, the final decision should be taken by. Furthermore, the second text emphasizes. And in conclusion, I recommend that. So you can see that when I was reading, I paused a little after the introductory word or phrase. And that's important. The reader needs to know when they should pause. It's subconscious usually when you're reading, but it helps with the flow and the organization of the text. So it's very important to use a comma after an introductory phrase or word. And the fourth way we use commas in English writing is with appositives. Now, an appositive is a noun which is used to identify another noun or a pronoun. So again, looking at the examples, it will become clear. Ben Gill, an English teacher, explained how to use commas in English writing. So again, it signals when to pause. If I say, Ben Gill, an English teacher, explained how to use commas in English writing, it sounds very strange, right? You need to pause. And the comma signals when the reader needs to pause. So Ben Gill, an English teacher, explained how to use commas in English writing. The Next one is, my neighbour, the headmaster of the local secondary school, is a lovely man. The Mona Lisa, Da Vinci's most famous painting, is in the Louvre Museum. Now, number 5, I would say, is probably the most common mistake that people make when using or not using commas in English writing. And when I say people, I mean native speakers and non-native speakers. But to be honest, in most situations, it doesn't really matter, because this use of the comma is usually in text messages or in informal emails or letters. But of course, if you're taking an English exam, it's important to use the comma correctly. So we're talking here about indirect address. So this is when naming the person to whom you are addressing. So that's why I say it's most common in text messages, WhatsApps, emails, letters, in informal situations. So technically there should be a comma before you name the person you are addressing. So the examples here: thanks for your help, Jenny. Looking forward to seeing you soon, Eddie. And let's eat, Grandma. So again, you can hear a short pause in all of those sentences before I say the name of the person. And as you can see with the last example, it's particularly important to use the comma because it can cause quite dangerous confusion. Because let's eat, Grandma, so let's eat, comma, Grandma, is very different to let's eat, Grandma. Can you see the difference? So let's eat, comma, Grandma is when you're talking to Grandma, you're addressing Grandma. But let's eat, Grandma is actually suggesting that Grandma is the meal. It's what we eat. So you have to be very careful. Okay, so let's move on to number 6 now. And again, this one's very common, and you probably know this one, and I would imagine you use it correctly. And it's when we use commas to separate items in a list. So looking at the examples there, in order to fight climate change, we must use public transport, eat less meat, and plant more trees. And at the supermarket, I bought beans, lettuce, milk, coffee, a courgette, and a bar of chocolate. Okay, so that one's quite simple, right? Well, actually there is an extra issue to talk about here, because there is some disagreement about whether we should use an extra comma here or not. So as you can see again from the examples, it's possible to add another comma before and in both of these examples. And this is what we call the Oxford comma. And some people think it's necessary and other people think it's unnecessary. I actually think it's unnecessary. I don't use the Oxford comma, but I do recognize that it can cause some confusion. There are certain situations, as you can see here, where perhaps people might get a bit confused or might misunderstand the situation if the comma is not used. But usually 99% of the cases the context is sufficient. There is not usually confusion. So moving on to number 7 now, and this is when we use commas for direct quotations. So when you want to quote maybe a famous person, or maybe you're just quoting what your friend said, depending on the writing task you are doing. But you need to use a comma before you directly quote someone. So these examples: the Prime Minister said, comma, it was a work event. The champagne and snacks were absolutely necessary. And Nelson Mandela wrote, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. Okay, so quite simple. You just have to remember to use the comma before the quote. Not too complicated, that one, right? And the last use of the comma that we're going to look at today is quite important, because you should be using these types of sentences in your writings. Not all of them, you don't have to force them into all of them, but often there's an opportunity or you need to use conditional sentences in your writings. And there's a little rule that you need to know because it makes a difference. I mean, maybe you think this rule is silly, but you know, the examiners may be looking out for this. We use a comma when the if clause precedes the main clause in a conditional sentence. As you probably know, in conditional sentences, the if clause can go first and the main clause second, or vice versa. The main clause can go first and the if clause second. So looking at this example, if you'd listened to Ben's advice, comma, you would have passed the exam. So you need the comma after the if clause. But if you use the main clause first, you don't need the comma. So you would have passed the exam if you'd listened to Ben's advice. Okay, so you may think that rule's a little bit unnecessary, and to be honest, I agree. I don't think these kind of rules are going to change the way we understand or the way we communicate, but they are rules. And if you're taking an exam, then you should try to follow the rules as closely as possible. Okay, I hope you found this video useful. It wasn't that boring, was it? I'm sorry if it was, but I'll be back very soon with another video on probably some vocabulary, so stay tuned for that. Okay, I'll see you soon.